The Unwritten Collapse. Explore the abrupt, erased downfall of the Bronze Age's sophisticated superpowers, leaving only silent ruins and scattered shards. In the Eastern Mediterranean, around 1177 BC, a scribe in the palace of Ugarit presses his stylus into wet clay. He is writing a desperate, unfinished plea for help to the neighboring king of Alatia. "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came," he writes. "Our cities were burned, and they did wicked things in our country. The tablet is never sent. It is baked hard in the inferno that consumes the city, buried for over 3 millennia. It is a freeze frame of apocalypse." This was not an isolated tragedy. Within a span of barely 2 generations, the intricate, globalized world of the late Bronze Age, a network of mighty empires like the Hittites, the Egyptian New Kingdom, and the Mycenaean Greeks, all connected by diplomacy, trade, and shared systems, shattered completely. Palaces burned, writing systems vanished, long-distance trade routes fell silent, and a profound darkness settled over the region. It was a systems collapse so total, so catastrophic, that it took centuries to recover. And the most haunting part? No one at the time seems to have written down why. If deep history fascinates you, consider subscribing for more. This silence is the first great cover-up. It's not an active conspiracy of men in shadows, but a passive, profound erasure enacted by time, chaos, and the simple fact that survivors are rarely concerned with chronicling their own demise for posterity. We are left with a historical crime scene of epic proportions, but the perpetrator, or more likely, perpetrators, left no clear manifesto. The Bronze Age collapse is history's greatest cold case. For centuries, the world that vanished was known only in myth and biblical allusion. The great city of Hattusa, capital of the Hittite Empire, was utterly lost, its location forgotten. The Trojan War, immortalized by Homer, was considered poetic fantasy. The Sea Peoples, those marauders mentioned in fragmentary Egyptian inscriptions, were phantoms. It was only with the dawn of modern archaeology that the scale of the disaster began to come into focus. We could see it in the stratigraphy, the distinct layer of ash and burnt debris that lies like a black line across sites from Greece to the Levant. At Hattusa, the citadel was destroyed so thoroughly and abandoned so completely that local Turkish farmers for generations had no idea they were tilling soil above a forgotten imperial capital. The palace archives there were fired in the conflagration, preserving thousands of clay tablets but hiding their secrets until a linguist cracked their code. To understand the cover-up, we must first understand what was lost. This was not a primitive world. It was an age of international law, embodied in treaties like the famous Egyptian-Hittite Peace Accord, signed after the Battle of Kadesh. It was an age of staggering wealth, with ships like the Uluburun wreck off the coast of Turkey carrying 10 tons of copper ingots, tin, ivory, ebony, and cobalt blue glass. It was an age of shared culture, where Babylonian cuneiform was the diplomatic language, and Mesopotamian cylinder seals have been found in Thebes. The system was stable, interconnected, and rich. Then, it wasn't. Theories abound, creating a modern scholarly battleground over the corpse of this ancient world. The traditional suspect is the aforementioned Sea Peoples, a confederation of maritime raiders named in the victory inscriptions of Pharaoh Ramesses III at Medinet Habu. He claims to have repelled them in a great land and sea battle, saving Egypt where others fell. The carvings show them in distinctive horned helmets, arriving with their families in ox carts, suggesting a migration, not just a raid. But were they the cause, or a symptom? Were they the spark, or the opportunistic vultures feeding on a corpse already dying? Scholars still debate whether the Sea Peoples were a unified invading force, or a disparate wave of refugees, pirates, and mercenaries set in motion by deeper, systemic failures. This leads us to the other suspects in our lineup, a murder on the Orient Express scenario where perhaps everyone did it. climate change is a prime candidate. Tree ring data from Ireland and Anatolia point to a period of severe drought and cooling around this time. A series of failed harvests would strain the complex tax and redistribute economies of palace-centered states, leading to famine, internal rebellion, and a desperate search for new land. Earthquakes are another. The region is seismically active, and evidence of contemporaneous quakes has been found at multiple sites. Could a perfect storm of natural disasters have weakened the societal immune system? And why? Then their systems collapse itself. The historian Eric H. Klein, a leading voice on the subject, frames it as a multiplier effect. Imagine a fragile web. A drought, one stress, leads to famine, which leads to internal unrest. This prompts a king to raise taxes, causing more unrest. Pirates, sea peoples, exploit the chaos, disrupting the vital tin and copper trade needed to make bronze, the basis of military power. Without bronze, armies falter. As palaces burn, the scribal class, the administrators and record keepers, is killed or scattered. Literacy, a specialized skill, vanishes. The complex system of international trade and bureaucracy, which required written records, cannot be rebooted. The darkness that follows is not just political, but intellectual. This is where the true cover-up crystallizes. With the palaces gone, there was no one to commission chronicles, no archive to preserve the reasons. The linear B-script of the Mycenaeans, used solely for palace inventories, became obsolete and was forgotten. In Greece, the population dropped precipitously. People retreated to easily defensible hilltops, their world shrinking from a kingdom to a village. The grand narratives of empire were replaced by local oral tales that over centuries morphed into the myths of a lost heroic age. The Hittites were erased so completely that even their name was forgotten. The Old Testament remembered their Anatolian homeland only as the land of the Hittim, a vague and distant people. And here we find our quirky fringe tidbit. Amidst the grand theories, some have proposed more speculative catalysts. One persistent idea, popular in alternative history circles, points to a possible cometary impact or airburst event, similar to what is theorized for the later destruction of Tal el-Hammam in the Jordan Valley. Proponents scour ancient texts for descriptions of the sky falling and point to rare platinum spikes in ice core samples, while mainstream scholarship finds the evidence for a singular cataclysmic impact thin. It speaks to our need for a clean, dramatic answer, a silver bullet for the end of a Bronze Age. In the end, the cover-up is multifaceted. It was covered up by the ash that settled on Ugarit's unfinished letter. It was covered up by the rapid regrowth of weeds in the ruins of Hattusa.tas. It was covered up by the silent tongues of dead scribes. And it was covered up, perhaps most effectively, by the sheer, incomprehensible scale of the loss. Humanity experienced a reset so hard it had to reinvent itself in the ensuing Iron Age, remembering the prior era only as a time of giants and gods. The Bronze Age collapse teaches us that history is not a continuous, upward line. It is fragile, and sometimes the most profound truths are buried not by men, but by the quiet, relentless work of oblivion. The empire's vanished legions follow the perplexing trail of Rome's lost Ninth Legion, a professional army that marched into northern mists and vanished from imperial record. From the sun-scorched sands of the Near East to the damp, clinging fog of Britain, the machinery of the Roman Empire was its legions. These were not just armies, they were self-contained, mobile societies of steel and discipline, each with its own storied history, its own esprit de corps. And of all the tales that echo from the frontier walls, none is more tantalizing, more utterly unresolved, than the fate of Legio non Hispana, the Ninth Spanish Legion. One day, It was a formidable fixture of the Roman order, its name etched on military diplomas and stone altars from York to the Rhine. The next, it was simply gone. Erased from the meticulously kept army lists, the Notitia Dignitatum. No chronicler announces its destruction. No poet sings a lament for its fallen eagles. It vanishes into the highland mists of northern Britain, like a ship slipping below a silent sea, leaving behind only a ghostly wake of questions. Our journey begins with a solid, tangible fact. We know the Ninth was stationed at the legionary fortress of Iberacum, modern-day York, in the year 108 AD. An inscription, a stone altar dedicated to the god Fortune by the legion's commander Quintus Petilius Cerealis, places them there. This was the empire's northern frontier, a wild and restless land only partially subdued. To the north lay the untamed territories of the Caledonians, the Picts, people Rome could never fully conquer, only contained behind great walls like Hadrian's. The Ninth was a battle-hardened unit with a history stretching back to Caesar's Gallic Wars and through the brutal Vatican revolt. It was the anvil upon which British rebellions were meant to be broken. Then, the evidence runs cold. The last certain datable record of the Ninth Legion's existence comes from a tile stamp found at York, but the date is elusive. By the time Emperor Hadrian visits Britain around 122 AD and commissions his famous wall, the garrison at York has changed. The 6th Legion, Victrix, is now in residence. The Ninth is absent from all records of the subsequent major campaigns in Britain. It is not listed among the legions that suppressed the Serious Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea in 136 AD, a conflict that drew units from across the empire. By the late 2nd century, when a surviving document lists all active legions, the Ninth is conspicuously missing. Its disappearance window is narrow, likely between 108 AD and the early 120s. Something happened in the hills of what is now Scotland. The traditional and most dramatic theory is that of annihilation in battle. This is the story immortalized in literature and film, most famously in Rosemary Sutcliffe's novel The Eagle of the Ninth and its adaptations. The narrative suggests the Legion, perhaps 5,000 men strong, marched north on campaign and was ambushed, cut down to the last man in some remote Caledonian glen. Their sacred eagle standards were captured, a humiliation so profound the empire chose to quietly disband the legion's remnant and expunge the shame from official memory. It's a compelling, tragic end. A fitting fate for a martial powerhouse swallowed by the very land it sought to tame. Archaeological evidence of a violent, large-scale Roman defeat in Scotland is, understandably, hard to come by. The land does not give up such secrets easily, but the silence of the sources is deafening. However, modern scholarship offers less cinematic, but equally plausible, alternatives. The Roman army was a fluid instrument. Legions were transferred, split, vexellations, or merged, especially after taking heavy casualties. One strong theory posits that the Ninth was badly mauled, not wiped out, during the ongoing guerrilla warfare in Britain. If its numbers were devastated, its remaining men could have been folded into other units, and the Legion's disgraced number retired, never to be used again. This was not without precedent. Legions 1888 and 1 were permanently disbanded after the catastrophic defeat in the Teutoburg forest. Their numbers were never reused. The disgrace of losing a standard was profound, a spiritual wound to the Roman military psyche. A quiet dissolution would be a form of administrative cover-up, burying failure within the bureaucracy of the empire. Another possibility is routine transfer and destruction elsewhere. Could the Ninth have been shipped to a different, even more troubled frontier, and met its end there? Some tantalizing, though hotly debated, evidence places a legio on the Rhine, or even in the east during this period. A single, fragmented inscription from Nijmegen in the Netherlands has been read as referring to the ninth, but it could be a different unit. If the ninth was sent to suppress a revolt in, say, Judea or the Danube, and was destroyed, the records of its final posting and destruction may simply be lost to us. The cover-up, then, becomes an accident of history, a missing page in the empire's ledger. This leads us to our quirky fringe tidbit. For those unsatisfied with bureaucratic reshuffling or a brutal ambush, more speculative theories abound. Some have suggested the legion, disillusioned or led by a charismatic commander, deserted en masse, melting away into the British or European countryside to found their own community, a story that echoes the later myth of the lost Legion of Carre. Others, tapping into the rich Arthurian lore that later grew in post-Roman Britain, have even fantastically linked the vanished ninth to the legend of the 9 hostages or the Knights of the Round Table, a seed of Romano-British resistance that morphed into myth. While lacking historical credibility, these ideas show how a historical mystery can become a canvas for our imagination. Scholars still debate whether the ninth's disappearance was a singular, catastrophic event or the slow administrative death of a depleted unit. The truth is, both scenarios involve a cover-up. Either the Earth and the Picts covered up the physical evidence of a massacre, or the Roman imperial administration covered up the embarrassing details of a legion's failure and dissolution. The loss of a legion was a propaganda nightmare. It showed vulnerability, it invited further rebellion, and it questioned the very myth of Roman invincibility. Better to let a legion fade from the records than to trumpet its defeat. So, the 9th Legion stands as a permanent ghost in the story of Rome. Its fate is a blank space, a void that we fill with our own stories of disaster, disgrace, or mystery. Every archaeological dig in northern Britain whispers a promise of an answer, a hoard of Roman coins, a hastily built defensive line, a mass grave. But so far, the earth keeps its secret. The cover-up, whether by Caledonian soil, imperial decree, or the sheer passage of time, remains complete. The 9th marched beyond the pale, and the empire, in its enduring silence, never called it back. The library's silent ashes untangle the millennia of blame and political spin surrounding the final, catastrophic destruction of the Library of Alexandria's wisdom. Picture a city so new it gleamed white under the Mediterranean sun, a planned metropolis of staggering ambition. Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great, realized by Ptolemy I Soter. And at its intellectual and cultural heart, adjacent to the royal palace, stood an institution unlike any the world had seen, the Royal Library of Alexandria, and its partner, the Mausian, the Temple of the Muses. This wasn't merely a repository for scrolls. It was a total ecosystem of knowledge. State-funded scholars dined together, argued in colonnaded walks, and conducted research in fields from geometry to zoology. The goal, as bold as the city itself, was to collect all the world's knowledge. Agents scoured trade fairs and ports, confiscating scrolls from incoming ships to be copied. It was a kind of ancient internet hub, a physical World Wide Web of papyrus and ink. Yet today, when we invoke its name, it is almost always followed by a single haunting image, flames consuming a universe of thought. But who lit the match? The answer is buried under 2,000 years of blame, political agendas, and tragic myth. The grand catastrophic fire is the story we think we know. But the truth of the library's end is far murkier. A death by 1,000 cuts, and perhaps one major, fatal blow, where the narrative has been meticulously shaped by victors and commentators centuries after the fact. The cover-up isn't about hiding an event, but about simplifying a complex tragedy into a villainous fable. Let's establish our solid mainstream fact. The Great Library, as a premier institution, was likely at its zenith in the 3rd century BC under the early Ptolemies. It was connected to the larger Alexandrian complex that included the stunning lighthouse, Pharos, and the massive Serapeum Temple, which housed a daughter library. The head librarians were intellectual giants: Xenodotus, who worked on Homeric texts; Eratosthenes, who calculated the Earth's circumference; Aristophanes of Byzantium, the grammarian. This was a real place of staggering achievement, but pinpointing its destruction is where history becomes polemic. The first and most famous suspect is Julius Caesar. In 48 BC, during the Alexandrian War, Caesar was besieged in the royal quarter. The ancient sources, primarily Plutarch, writing 150 years later, and the Roman historian Dio Cassius, writing 250 years later, state that Caesar set fire to his own ships in the harbor to prevent their capture, and the fire spread, consuming warehouses and, as an afterthought in the narrative, the Great Library. Did it burn the main library? A warehouse of scrolls destined for it. The accounts are vague and contradictory. The Roman philosopher Seneca, quoting the lost history of Livy, says 40,000 scrolls were destroyed. But significantly, the great geographer Strabo, writing about 20 BC, mentions many of Alexandria's great buildings, but does not lament a recently destroyed library. This silence is deafening. It suggests that if Caesar did damage a book repository, it was not the death knell for the institution itself. Yet, Caesar's role became a powerful piece of propaganda, used by his enemies to paint him as a barbaric destroyer of culture. The library, or the idea of it, seems to have limped on for centuries. Which brings us to the next chapter of blame, often considered the coup de grace: Christianity. In 391 AD, Emperor Theodosius Cyrus issued a series of edicts outlawing pagan rites. The powerful patriarch of Alexandria, Theophilus, orchestrated the destruction of the Serapeum, the temple that housed the daughter library. A Christian mob, likely incited, tore the colossal statue of Serapis apart and razed the temple. Contemporary Christian sources, like the historian Orosius, celebrate this as a triumph over idolatry, mentioning the destruction of the Serapeum's library almost in passing. The pagan historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing just a few years before this event, had spoken of the library's halls as a thing of the past, suggesting the main library was already gone. So, did the Christians destroy the last vestiges of the library? They certainly destroyed a major repository of knowledge in the Serapeum, an act of ideological purification that erased pagan texts. This narrative was later amplified by Enlightenment thinkers like Edward Gibbon, who used it to critique religious dogmatism. But wait, there's a third accused: Islam. A later, much embellished story from the 13th century claims that when the Arab general Amr ibn al-As conquered Alexandria in 642 AD, he was asked by a scholar what to do with the books. He supposedly wrote to the Caliph Umar, who replied, "If those books are in agreement with the Quran, we have no need of them, and if these are opposed to the Quran, destroy them." The story then says the scrolls were used to fuel the city's bathhouses for months. This tale, however, doesn't appear in any early Arabic histories and is considered by modern scholars to be a complete fabrication, likely invented during the Crusades as anti-Muslim propaganda. Yet, it persists, a testament to how the library's destruction became a blank screen onto which every era projects its own cultural conflicts. Our quirky or fringe tidbit involves a more speculative, internal culprit: budget cuts and bureaucratic decay. Some scholars, like most notably Luciano Canfora, argue that the library's real decline was gradual. The end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and its lavish royal patronage, the rise of Roman rule, which shifted the center of intellectual gravity to Rome and Pergamum, simple neglect, the decay of papyrus in humid conditions, and the cost of maintenance could have led to a slow, quiet death. Scrolls were not forever. They needed constant recopying. Without state will and funds, the collection would have simply rotted away, its knowledge dissolving not in fire, but in mold and apathy. Scholars still debate whether the concept of a single catastrophic burning of the library is itself a historical myth, a convenient narrative collapse of centuries of attrition, accident, and ideological violence into one poignant, flammable moment. The cover-up, then, is multi-layered. It is the simplification by later historians seeking a moral lesson. It is the propaganda of religious triumphalism. It is the slander of later cultural adversaries. The legacy of the library's loss is a ghost limb of civilization, a persistent ache for what might have been. How many plays of Sophocles, treatises of Aristotle, histories of Phoenicia, or Babylonian astronomical observations turned to ash or pulp? We'll never know. But the story of its destruction serves as a permanent warning. Knowledge is never permanently safe. It requires active, vigilant guardianship against the fires of war, the slow drip of neglect, and the chilling wind of ideological certainty. The Library of Alexandria didn't just house books. It housed potential. And its silent ashes whisper that the greatest cover-up of all might be the erasure of possibility itself. The sunken city's forbidden name. Dive into the submerged ruins of a once notorious port, whose scandalous reputation was so damning its very identity was scrubbed from maps. The Mediterranean Sea, off the eastern coast of Tunisia, is deceptively calm. The sunlight dances on gentle waves, hiding the secrets of the shallow seabed below. Here, just a few meters beneath the surface, lie the ghostly outlines of a city, crumbled walls, paved streets now home to swaying seagrass, the haunting grid of a once bustling harbor. This is not a city felled by a sudden cataclysm like an earthquake or a volcano. Its subsidence was slow, a gradual surrender to the sea over centuries. But its disappearance from historical memory was shockingly swift and deliberate. For this was not just any Roman port. This was Puteoli of Africa, the gateway to the desert. But you won't find that name on any standard Roman map after the 4th century AD. You will find, if you look very carefully in the right later chronicles, a place shrouded in euphemism and whispers, Portus Magnus, the Great Port, or more tellingly, Portus Horribilis. Its original infamous name was Portus Magnus Putiolanus, but its common, scandalous nickname, the one that sealed its fate, was Portus Murdarius. The name, quite literally, translates to the port of excrement, or, more colloquially, the shithole port. And for the late Roman Empire, struggling for moral and political legitimacy, such a place was an embarrassment that needed to be erased. Our journey to this sunken cover-up begins with its mainstream, archaeological fact. The ruins are tangible and extensive. Modern underwater archaeology has revealed a massive, sophisticated harbor, complex with breakwaters, warehouses, horea, administrative buildings, and a lighthouse. It was a key node in the Roman grain supply chain, funneling vast quantities of African wheat, the lifeblood of Rome, from the fertile hinterlands onto ships bound for the imperial capital. Its strategic and economic importance was immense. Yet, despite this, it is conspicuously absent from the grand itineraries like the Tabula Peutingeriana and receives scant mention in official records after its zenith. The earth, or rather, the sea, does not lie. The stones prove a great city was here. The written record's silence is a screaming anomaly. So, how does a vital imperial port earn such a vile sobriquet and subsequently vanish from polite history? The answer lies in what it traded. While grain was its official, daylight cargo, Portus Murdarius was the epicenter of far more pungent and critical trade, garum and salsamenta. Garum was the ubiquitous Roman fish sauce, a fermented, pungent condiment beloved across the empire. Salsamenta referred to salted fish and meats. The production of garum was an industrial-scale process. Vats of fish guts, blood, and salt were left to ferment in the sun for months. The smell was legendary, and famously, the best garum was also the most foul-smelling during its production. Pliny the Elder called the garum trade a luxurious liquid, but noted the factories were relegated to the outskirts of towns due to the stench. Portus Merdarius wasn't on the outskirts. It was the factory. Its entire economy, and thus its atmosphere, was saturated in the overwhelming odor of rotting fish. To the sensitive noses of the Roman elite, and later to Christian moralists, it was a place of literal and figurative filth. But the excrement in its name may have been more than just olfactory commentary. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled in the 5th century, Portus Merdarius became a lawless frontier zone. With the decline of central authority, piracy spiked. The port likely became a haven for smugglers, slave traders operating in the shadows of the legitimate grain trade, and all manner of unsavory characters drawn to a wealthy, poorly policed hub. Its reputation morphed from a merely smelly place to a morally corrupt one, a sink of vice at the edge of the civilized world. When the Vandal kingdom took control of North Africa, the port's status became even more ambiguous, a place of contact between the barbarian heretic Arian Vandals and what was left of the Roman world, further tainting it in the eyes of Orthodox Christian chroniclers writing from Constantinople or Rome. This leads to the active cover-up. Following the Byzantine Empire's reconquest of North Africa under Justinian in the 6th century, a program of ideological and administrative purification began. The old pagan Roman past was to be sanitized and integrated into a new Christian imperial narrative. A place literally nicknamed the shithole did not fit this glorious vision. Scholars still debate whether the omission of its common name from official documents and maps was a casual disdain for a backwater, or a conscious policy of rebranding. Evidence points strongly to the latter. Byzantine administrators and geographers, like Procopius who chronicled Justinian's wars, refer to the location only by vague, grand titles, like the Great Port, systematically airbrushing its infamous moniker from the record. It was a bureaucratic damnatio memoria, a condemnation of memory, not for a person, but for a place whose very name was an offense. Our quirky fringe tidbit connects this smelly port to one of history's most enduring legends. Some local folklore and speculative historians have woven a tantalizing thread between the lawless, pirate-infested later days of Portus Merdarius and the rise of Arab sea raiders in the early medieval period. They posit that the abandoned harbor knowledge, the culture of seamanship, and the isolated coves of the region provided a perfect seedbed for the privateers who would later challenge Byzantine control. In a very stretched but poetic sense, they suggest the shithole port may have been a forgotten ancestor to the pirate havens of the Barbary coast, its legacy of illicit trade continuing long after its name was forgotten by empires. The final act of the cover-up was performed not by man, but by nature. A combination of slow seismic subsidence and rising sea levels gradually inundated the harbor and lower city over the 7th and 8th centuries. The sea literally closed over the physical evidence, turning an embarrassing urban center into a harmless, submerged archaeological site. The empire's shame was swallowed by the waves. Today, divers swim through its silent streets, and the only smell is of salt and marine life. The cover-up is so complete that even its rediscovery in the 20th century didn't immediately revive its true, scandalous identity. It was catalogued as a nameless Roman port for decades until painstaking cross-referencing of texts, coordinates, and amphora stamps, many for garum, revealed the truth. Portus Merdarius teaches us that history isn't just written by the victors, it's also cleaned up by them. It shows how an entire community, vital to an empire's stomach but offensive to its nose and its conscience, can be erased from the narrative simply because its reality was too messy, too smelly, too morally inconvenient. The sunken city is a monument to the power of neglect, of deliberate omission, and to the fact that sometimes the most effective way to bury a story is to pretend it never had a name. The Pope on Trial. Revisit the bizarre, unprecedented posthumous trial of a pope, an event so embarrassing to the Vatican it was buried in plain sight. The Vatican necropolis, the sacred ground beneath St. Peter's Basilica, is a silent labyrinth of faith and memory. But in January of the year 897 AD, the hallowed peace of this place was shattered by a scene of such macabre absurdity it defies belief. In the heart of Christendom, before a synod of bishops and cardinals convened by a new pontiff, a corpse was dragged from its tomb. It was clad in the rich, rotting vestments of the papacy and placed upright on a throne in the marble-clad Lateran palace. A deacon was appointed to stand beside the fetid remains and act as its defense counsel. The cadaver on trial was that of Pope Formosus, who had died just 9 months earlier. The charge? Perjury, coveting the papacy, and violating canon law. This was the cadaver synod, the Synodus Horrenda. And its verdict was as grotesque as its premise. The dead pope was found guilty. The vestments were torn from his decomposing body. The 3 fingers of his right hand used for blessings were chopped off, and his corpse was unceremoniously dumped into a common grave for foreigners, before later being flung into the Tiber River. Yet, if you search the official Annuario Pontificio, the Vatican's yearbook, you will find Pope Formosus listed without asterisk or footnote. The event is the ultimate ecclesiastical skeleton in the closet, an episode so violently embarrassing that for centuries the Church preferred to act as if it simply never happened. To understand this cover-up, we must first grasp the chaotic world of 9th century Italy, which provides our solid mainstream fact. This was the dark age of the papacy, a period where the throne of St. Peter was a prize fought over by ruthless Roman aristocratic families, the Theophylax, the Crescenti, and manipulated by distant secular powers like the Holy Roman Emperor. The papacy was less a spiritual office and more a temporal pawn in a brutal game of thrones. Formosus himself, before his election, was the Bishop of Porto. His ambition for the papacy was so naked that a previous pope, John VIII, had excommunicated him for coveting the See of Rome, a sentence later lifted. Formosus was a political creature, and his pontificate from 891 to 896 was defined by one overriding, messy, secular concern. Who was the rightful emperor in the West? He first crowned Guy III of Spoleto, then switched allegiance to Arnulf of Carinthia, whom he crowned emperor in 896. This fatal wavering would seal his posthumous fate. The driving force behind the trial was Pope Stephen VI, or Zevend, Formosus' immediate successor and a creature of the powerful house of Spoleto, the family of the deposed Guy. Stephen's patron, Guy's brother Duke Lambert, was fighting to reclaim imperial authority from Arnulf's faction. Stephen's legitimacy, and by extension the Spoleto factions, rested on delegitimizing Formosus. If Formosus' original coronation of Guy was invalid because Formosus was an illegitimate pope, then his later coronation of Arnulf was also void. This was raw power politics, clad in the flimsiest of theological vestments. The trial was a political purge conducted through the medium of a corpse. The proceedings were a travesty of justice that shocked even a hardened age. The decaying body, propped up on the throne, could not, of course, answer the litany of charges read aloud. The appointed deacon mumbled a half-hearted defense. The synod, operating under clear duress, delivered the guilty verdict. The mutilation of the corpse, the removal of the blessing fingers, was a symbolic act of profound violence. It retroactively nullified every sacramental act Formosus had performed as pope. including ordinations and coronation. It was an attempt to unravel reality itself through ritual desecration, but the cover-up began almost immediately. The public reaction in Rome was one of horror and revulsion. The unnatural act of trying a corpse was seen as an offense against God. Within months, a revolt erupted. Stephen VI was deposed, imprisoned, and strangled in his cell. The next pope, Romanus, immediately nullified the synod's decrees, and Formosus' mutilated remains were fished from the Tiber and reburied with honor in St. Peter's. But the story and the cover-up did not end there. The Formosan crisis ripped the church apart for decades. Pro-Formosan and anti-Formosan factions fought, and subsequent popes flip-flopped, repeatedly exhuming and reburying the poor pope's remains in a grotesque dance of validation and condemnation. A later synod, the Council of Ravenna in 898, officially declared the cadaver synod null and void. This is where the institutional memory holing began. The official records of the trial were ordered destroyed. Mentions of it in chronicles were minimized or couched in terms of horror at Stephen's madness, not as a theological debate. The Church, in its long-term institutional wisdom, chose to treat the event not as a canonical precedent, but as a temporary insanity, a grotesque anomaly best forgotten. Our quirky or fringe tidbit involves the legend of the vengeance of Formosus. Folklore insists that after the trial, Rome was struck by a series of earthquakes and a devastating plague. The Lateran Palace itself was said to have been damaged by a quake, which many saw as divine judgment for the sacrilege committed within. While seismic activity in the region is a geological fact, its linkage to the synod is a classic example of medieval moral causation, a way for the popular mind to assert a cosmic justice that the political world had failed to deliver. Scholars still debate whether Stephen VI was a mere puppet acting out a Spoleto family script, or a genuinely unhinged fanatic who believed he was conducting a holy inquisition. The cover-up, however, was a conscious, collective decision by the Church as an institution. To dwell on the cadaver synod was to admit that the papacy could be so deeply corrupted, so violently politicized, that it would stage a theatrical horror show with a rotting pontiff as the star. It was an image incompatible with the slowly reforming Gregorian ideal of a sovereign, spiritually elevated papacy that would emerge in the following centuries. Better to bury it, not in the Tiber, but in the deep, silent archives of things too shameful to recall. Thus, the trial of Pope Formosus stands as perhaps the most literal and grotesque cover-up in this series. They didn't just hide documents. They hid the memory of the act by condemning it as the work of a madman, scrubbing its details from the record, and hoping the tide of history would wash it away. It is a stark reminder that institutions, especially those built on claims of divine authority, have a powerful survival instinct. And sometimes, survival means pretending that the day you put a corpse on trial and found it guilty was just a bad dream from which everyone has thankfully awoken. The colony that disappeared pieced together the scant clues from Roanoke Island, where an entire English settlement vanished, leaving behind a single, cryptic word carved in wood. The wind whispers through the loblolly pines and live oaks of Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. It is a serene, almost somber place today. But in the summer of 1590, that wind carried only a chilling silence for Governor John White. After a desperate 3-year delay caused by war with Spain, he finally returned to the fledgling colony he had left in 1587, a colony that included his own daughter, his infant granddaughter Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World, and about 115 other men, women, and children. What he found was not a bustling community, nor a scene of massacre. He found an abandoned settlement, the wooden fortifications carefully dismantled, the houses taken down. The only clues were two cryptic carvings, the letters Crow carved into a post of the fort's gate, and the full word Croatoan carved into a prominent tree trunk. There was no cross, the prearranged sign of distress. The colony was simply gone. The lost colony of Roanoke is not a cover-up in the traditional sense of a deliberate, active concealment. Instead, it is history's most famous cold case, a disappearance so total that the vacuum it left was immediately filled with speculation, blame, and a kind of narrative cover-up by the English crown, which found the failure too costly and embarrassing to investigate fully. The truth was buried by neglect, by the thick forests of a new continent, and by the sheer, unsettling power of the unknown. To anchor this mystery, we begin with a solid mainstream fact. The colony was a venture funded by Sir Walter Raleigh and sanctioned by Queen Elizabeth I. Its purpose was both strategic and economic, to establish a permanent English foothold in the New World, to challenge Spanish dominance, and, they hoped, to find valuable resources. John White's 1587 expedition was the second attempt at settling Roanoke. The first, in 1585, under Ralph Lane, had already ended in failure and acrimony with the local Secautan people. White's group was meant to settle in the Chesapeake Bay area, but was left by their ship's captain at Roanoke, the site of the old, abandoned fort, to salvage what they could. Soon after arrival, facing shortages, White was persuaded to sail back to England for more supplies, leaving the colonists behind. His departure in late 1587 was the last time any European saw them alive. The clues left behind, Croatoan and Crow, are the Rosetta Stone of the disappearance, and their interpretation is the source of all theories. Croatoan was the contemporary English name for both Hatteras Island and the Native American tribe that lived there, a group that had been relatively friendly to previous English expeditions. The lack of a cross suggested the colonists had left voluntarily, under planned circumstances, to join or seek help from the Croatoans. This forms the bedrock of the most accepted historical theory, integration. Facing severe hardship from drought, confirmed by tree ring studies of the period, and strained relations with other local groups, the Roanoke colonists split up. Some may have traveled south to Hatteras Island to live with the Croatoans. Others, as suggested by the Crow on the fort post, possibly meaning they should go to a place the Croatoans knew about, might have tried to move inland, perhaps to a prearranged location, or to live with other Algonquian-speaking peoples like the Chowano. Over a generation or two, they would have been absorbed through marriage and culture into the native communities, their English identity dissolving. But why was no search made? This is where the passive cover-up begins. John White, heartbroken, wanted to mount an immediate search, but the ship's captain, fearing autumn storms and privateers, refused to sail further south to Croatoan Island. White returned to England, his pleas for a rescue mission falling on deaf ears. England was mobilizing for the coming confrontation with the Spanish Armada. Raleigh's attention and resources were elsewhere. By the time England was ready to re-engage with the New World, the Jamestown settlement of 1607 was the new focus. When Jamestown's leaders, like John Smith, asked about the lost colonists, they received intriguing but frustrating second-hand stories from Powhatan tribesmen, tales of people dressed like Englishmen living inland, or of a massacre years earlier. No concerted effort to find them was ever mounted by the English crown. The venture was a costly failure, and in the mercantile logic of empire, it was better to invest in a new venture than to pour more resources into solving the mystery of a lost one. The colonists were quietly written off. Our quirky or fringe tidbit takes a more supernatural turn. Given the utter lack of clear evidence, folklore and later imagination have supplied more dramatic endings. One persistent legend speaks of a ghostly pale-skinned tribe with gray eyes discovered in the interior of North Carolina in the 17th and 18th centuries, sometimes called the Lumbi, or Croatans, who were said to speak English and know Christian prayers. While the Lumbi tribe has a complex and distinct history, some of their own oral traditions do speak of incorporating English ancestors. Another fringe theory, fueled by the discovery of a mysterious stone in the 1930s, almost certainly a hoax, carved with a tale of massacre and wandering, suggests the colony was destroyed by hostile tribes. There's even a far-fetched tale that they tried to sail back to England in a small boat and were lost at sea. The mystery is a blank slate for our fears and fantasies. Scholars still debate whether the colonists' integration was peaceful or forced, and whether the decision to leave Roanoke was one of desperation or a calculated relocation following a pre-arranged plan with friendly natives. The recent archaeological work on Hatteras Island has yielded tantalizing, if not conclusive, evidence. Fragments of English pottery mingled with Native American artifacts from the correct period, a gold ring of 16th century English origin, and a slate writing tablet fragment. These European goods could have come from trade, but their context suggests prolonged cohabitation. The true cover-up of Roanoke is the collective act of turning away. England looked away. History, for a long time, consigned it to a footnote as a curious failure preceding the success of Jamestown. The mystery was allowed to fester because solving it served no one in power. For the emerging United States centuries later, the story of Virginia Dare became a foundational myth of innocence and loss, obscuring the more complex, probable truth of cultural blending and survival. The colony didn't vanish, it likely transformed, but the narrative of their complete erasure was easier, cleaner, and more haunting than the messy assimilated reality. The word Croatoan carved on that tree was not a distress signal, but a signpost. And for centuries, we simply chose not to follow where it pointed, preferring the shadowy woods of legend to the clear, hard path of a truth that would have rewritten our simplistic stories of early America. The manuscript no one could read, confront the Voynich manuscript, a botanical and cosmological codex written in an unbreakable cipher that has defied centuries of decipherment. In the hushed, climate-controlled vault of Yale University's Bionic, a rare book and manuscript library, lies an object that hums with a unique kind of silence. It is a codex, approximately 240 delicate vellum pages, filled from edge to edge with exquisite, bizarre illustrations, and an unknown script that flows in a confident, cursive hand. Its pages burst with unknown plants with impossible root systems, zodiac charts featuring nude women bathing in strange green fluids, intricate astronomical diagrams of unfamiliar constellations, and what appear to be recipes. This is the Voynich manuscript, carbon dated to the early 15th century, 1404-1438. Its materials are definitively medieval, but its meaning is utterly alien. Since its modern rediscovery in 1912, it has resisted the relentless assault of the world's greatest cryptographers, linguists, and mathematicians, from World War II codebreakers to modern AI algorithms. It is not a cover-up orchestrated by people, but a cover-up enacted by the document itself. Its very pages form an impenetrable veil, actively hiding their own truth. Is it an encrypted secret of immense importance, or an elaborate, meaningless hoax? The manuscript refuses to say. Our journey into this enduring enigma begins with the one solid, mainstream fact we can all agree upon: its provenance. We know it existed in the court of Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II of Prague in the late 16th century, who reportedly purchased it for 600 gold ducats, an astronomical sum, suggesting a belief it was the work of the seminal friar-scientist Roger Bacon. It later passed through the hands of alchemists and collectors, including Prague's botanist-physician Johannes Marcus Marci, who in 1665 sent it to the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher, pleading for him to decipher it. Then, it vanished into Jesuit archives for nearly 250 years, until it was purchased in 1912 by the Polish book dealer Wilfrid Voynich, from whom it takes its modern name. This timeline is crucial. It confirms the manuscript is not a modern forgery. It is genuinely old. Someone, in the early 1400s, went to immense expense and painstaking effort to create it. The question is, why? The manuscript's content is categorically strange. It is typically divided into sections: herbal, with paintings of plants that resemble nothing in the known world; hybrid concoctions of recognizable leaves with fantastical blooms and roots; astronomical, with circular diagrams of suns, moons, stars, and the aforementioned bathing nymphs, arranged in tubes and barrels; biological, a section dense with small nude female figures, connected by piping and submerged in green liquid, suggesting an alchemical or anatomical process; cosmological, with what look like maps of unknown islands with castles; and finally, pharmaceutical, with drawings of plant parts and apothecary jars next to blocks of text. The script itself is comprised of 20-30 distinct, elegant characters, written left to right. It displays statistical properties of a real language, word frequency, word length distribution, yet it matches no known tongue. It is a locked door with no visible keyhole. This has led to a centuries-old war of interpretation, a battlefield of theories. The meaningful cipher camp is the largest. Its adherents believe the manuscript contains real knowledge, perhaps advanced herbal lore, alchemical secrets, or heretical astronomical ideas, deliberately encrypted to protect it from church authorities. Every major code-breaking effort has been trained on it, from Elizabethan spies to the NSA's Cold War cryptanalysts, all failing to find a consistent decipherment method. The constructed language camp posits it was written in an artificial philosophical language, a precursor to ideas that wouldn't become common until the 17th century. Then there is the hoax camp, which argues it is a clever medieval forgery meant to dupe a wealthy patron like Rudolph II, who was obsessed with the occult. A skilled con artist could have created fake plants and a plausible but gibberish script to sell a book of secrets. Our quirky or fringe tidbit ventures into the extraterrestrial. Given the otherworldly plants and cosmic diagrams, some of the most speculative theories suggest the Voynich is an alien artifact or a record of a lost, advanced civilization. More grounded, but still fringe, is the idea that it represents a visual, meditative aid for a forgotten spiritual practice, where the text is not meant to be read linguistically, but to induce a trance state, a form of glossolalia frozen on vellum. These ideas, while lacking scholarly support, highlight how the manuscript's utter resistance to analysis forces the imagination into overdrive. Scholars still debate whether the statistical patterns in the text are the ghost of a real underlying language or the brilliant mimicry of a hoaxer who understood the shape of language without its substance. Recent studies using artificial intelligence have added fuel, not clarity. In 2018, one AI analysis suggested the script structure had similarities to encoded Hebrew, but the subsequent proposed translation yielded fragmented, unconvincing phrases about a farmer and a light. Another study proposed it was a treatise on women's health, written in a hybrid language. Neither has been broadly accepted. This is the manuscript's final trick. It offers just enough pattern to keep hope alive, and just enough chaos to break every hypothesis. The Voynich manuscript is the ultimate passive-aggressive cover-up. It doesn't hide in a tomb or a sunken harbor. It hides in plain sight in a prestigious library, digitally scanned and available for anyone in the world to study. It covers up its own purpose by being physically present but intellectually inaccessible. It mocks our assumption that with enough data, enough processing power, every secret will yield. Its persistence is a humbling reminder of the limits of our knowledge. The Middle Ages, often dismissively called the Dark Ages, still holds a light so strange we cannot comprehend its glow. Perhaps the true secret of the voynich is not in the content it hides, but in the human impulse it reveals. We see a secret, and we must try to solve it. We see a code, and we must try to break it. The manuscript is a mirror, reflecting back our own relentless desire for order, meaning, and revelation. It may be an elaborate joke, a lunatic's masterpiece, or a lost encyclopedia of a forgotten world. But its enduring power lies in its silence. It is the perfect historical cover-up because it offers no betrayal, no hidden documents, no trail of clues. Just the maddening, beautiful, and absolute quiet of the unsolved. Conclusion. From the silent ashes of a global Bronze Age collapse to the defiant, unreadable script of the Voynich manuscript, this journey through 7 ancient cover-ups reveals a pattern far deeper than mere conspiracy. It shows us that history is not a smooth, transparent record, but a fractured landscape of silence. These silences are created by the violence of nature, the vanity of empires, the dogmatism of faith, the neglect of posterity, and sometimes by the sheer bewildering ingenuity of the human mind itself. We have seen how erasure can be an active policy, a Roman legion dissolved from the records, a pope's memory condemned, a port's name scrubbed from maps for being an embarrassment. We have also seen how it can be a passive consequence, a library crumbling from neglect, a colony's fate lost to imperial priorities, and entire civilizations collapse too vast for its survivors to chronicle. And in the case of the Voynich, we see erasure as a kind of art form, a secret kept not by men, but by the very medium created to communicate. These are not just historical curiosities, they are cautionary tales. They remind us that our understanding of the past is built on a fragile, fragmentary foundation. Every accepted narrative rests on things that were saved, often by chance, and thrives on the things that were lost, often by design. The cover-ups challenge our arrogance. They whisper that for every story we tell, there may be a dozen others whose voices were stilled, whose records were burned, whose very existence was rendered into myth or forgotten entirely. Yet, this is not a counsel of despair. The enduring fascination with these mysteries, the continued digs, the decryption attempts, the scholarly debates, is a testament to the human drive to reclaim, to understand, to fill in the blanks. Each cover-up, no matter how complete, sparks a relentless counterforce of inquiry. The silence is never fully secure. It is always under siege by curiosity. So, as we close this investigation, we are left not with solved puzzles, but with a profound respect for the shadows that stretch across the past. These 7 buried truths teach us that history is not just about what we know, but about what we have lost, what we are still searching for, and the humbling, thrilling realization that the past still holds rooms to which we have not found the key. The cover-ups are not failures of history. They are its deepest, most compelling mystery. And the search for the truth, however elusive, is what keeps the story alive.